Well, AJ, this is video number 4. You don't just have Polish heritage, Polish-Russian heritage with some Squaxin and whatever else is thrown in. You also have English, Scottish, and Micmac heritage. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. It starts with a man by the name of William Braun, B-R-A-U-N, who is living in Scotland, although he has relatives living in Germany. Scottish-German descent. And what's happened in Scotland is that there really isn't a lot of work for 18, 19-year-olds, and that's about how old he is at this stage of the game where the story opens. But he knows that there's work over in the new country because there's the French have lost the war. The Brits are now in charge mostly, except around Quebec and places like that where the French are still in charge. And the Hudson Bay Company has opened. Now, the Hudson Bay Company is primarily interested in getting the pelts of wild animals like polar bears and wolves and beavers and things like that back to Europe to be made into coats, cloaks, and blankets. The beaver coat was considered, one of the finest things a person of substance could wear. So the Hudson Bay Company opens trading posts where Native Americans, Micmacs, Algonquins, Iroquois, Cree, can bring the pelts and skins and exchange them for iron knives, steel knives, pots and kettles and things that make cooking so much easier, canvas to cover their summer dwellings with instead of fur, much more comfortable, air can get through, rifles to make hunting, just all kinds of stuff. So William Braun gets the passage together somehow. It probably goes over in a coffin ship, what we used to call coffin ships. In other words, there's so many people on the lowest status of where they usually carry cargo that they have to bring their own lunch and pee in a jar, practically. I mean, there are no services for them. And he gets to the New World, and he starts to work for the Hudson Bay Company as a trapper. In other words, he goes out into the woods, and he also traps animals and brings the pelts back. Now, the Indians don't like this, because the Indians don't take an animal's pelt unless they've killed the animal so they can eat it. They had to live, so they would kill deer and moose and bear and beavers and squirrels and all kinds of things, and they would not waste anything. Even the bones were used for needles and things, but they would never go out and just kill an animal for its fur. They would never do that. In fact, Native Americans would always apologize to the spirit of the animal and to God, to the Great Spirit, for having to take the life. And one of the reasons the Indians so loved what they called the fire sticks, rifles, they loved those because it meant that they could kill an animal with as little stress on the animal as possible. And that's what they strived to do as hunters. It broke their hearts when their arrows and spears missed, and the beast, the moose, had to travel through the woods, losing blood and getting weaker and weaker, and finally they would have to finish it off with clubs. I mean, they didn't like it, and the moose didn't like it, So the Indians didn't like the fact that white men were doing trapping, because they wouldn't eat the meat very often, unless it was deer. Well, at any rate, that's another whole story. So William Braun travels a certain route where there are Hudson Bay trading posts built or being built, and he ends up way over by Lake Erie, and it's Micmac territory. It's actually Micmac territory from Nova Scotia, all the way to Winnipeg, Canada, because even the Cree are sort of related to the Algonquin language, and they're all it's a big clan. Well, somewhere along the line, William Braun meets a Micmac girl and falls in love with her, and she falls in love with him. And she begins to travel with him. And basically what he's doing now, because she really speaks to him about what's wrong with just killing an animal for its fur. So what they're doing together is that he's taking things like knives and rifles and usually smaller things that they can both carry, beads. Beadwork is important to Native Americans everywhere. Beads and knives and things that they can use, and he's trading those for furs and taking them back to the Hudson Bay Trading Post. And that's what they do. Well, then, of course, eventually she gets pregnant, and they end up moving to what was then called Little Bedeque, Nova Scotia, right below, it's south of Bedeque, called Little Bedeque, and today it's sort of like the University District in Seattle. Well, you're not familiar with that. With Cedar Park in Austin, it's sort of all one thing now, but it wasn't then. And he works his way up to manager of a Hudson Bay store, William does. And we know very little about his Micmac wife, because she converts to his religion. She goes to wearing dresses instead of leather outfits. She just sort of, lots of Micmac people really adapted Western ways quickly. There were actually so few men coming over to that far northern part of the country that lots of Micmac men took jobs in sawmills and other places. And the first thing you know, they and their families are living in the same village as the French, and often the French are living in some of the same village. They all got mixed up. They got along well. The Indians and the French got along pretty well. It's the English that they get along with. Well, at any rate, William and his wife have some children, and one of them they named Jack. Jack or John. And they raise him there in Little Bedeque. And he's becoming an adult. In England, a violinist, I don't know her first name, I know her last name was Alexander. She's a concert violinist. She isn't just a fiddle player. She's also married, and she really isn't very interested in raising her children, because she's very interested in playing her violin before the crown heads of Europe, and with the Paris Symphony and this symphony and that symphony, and they had enough money that the kids could go to boarding schools, and they had tutors and companions for them, and it wasn't a terrible life. Except it wasn't very pleasant to Blanche. Their daughter Blanche didn't like it. So when she was 12 years old, she got permission to live with an aunt, an uncle who lived in Berkshire, in England. And they were pretty strict people. And Blanche was kind of a free thinker. So when she turned the age of 14, which is still the age of consent through Europe, 14, she sold herself to be an indentured slave. Well, what's that? Well, you find a family in the New World who will support you and sponsor you and give you a job for like a 2-year period, 2.5 years, 3 years sometimes. But they pay your passage, so you have a comfortable passage to America, and it's paid for, and you have a job waiting for you, because as an indentured slave, you have rights, you have a place to live, they feed you, and you get a stipend that you can tuck away, so that when the 2 or 3 years is up, that you've paid back your passage and everything else, you have some money set aside to start your own life. So Blanche, I mean, that's a very independent thing for a 14-year-old girl to do. And she comes over and sells herself to the McLeod family. Sarah Jean Blanche, Thomas McLevin, McLeod. McLevins or the McLeods, it doesn't matter, one of the two. and really doesn't meet Jack yet. And then there's a problem of some kind with the McLeods, and Mrs. McLeod ends up moving first to Boston and then to New York City. And also, the son of William up in Little Bedeck he's proven to be very good at figures and that sort of stuff, and he actually has a job through the Hudson Bay Company. He met a fellow working in New York at the Anaconda Mine Company, where their headquarters is in New York. And don't you know that Blanche and Jack meet in New York? And they fall in love. But they don't want to raise their kids in New York, because even way back then, big cities. He has a chance to take a job with the Anaconda Company in Montana, at Helena, Montana. And he's going to be in charge of all the cooking and stuff that goes on to feed, because they have tons of people working in all those mines, and they have to be fed, and they're bringing in, it's not just feeding them. You gotta bring in animals. You gotta send out hunters to get deer. You gotta have gardens. You gotta get trains. It's a lot of people working for them. And Blanche got the job of actually running the kitchen, the cooking, for a while. Well, that was fine until they started having children, and they had 3 of their children. They had Doc, William, named after his grandfather, and Paul, and Jim, and Peggy. And they realized that with the exception of the Anaconda Company, there was no place for those boys to really get a decent education and get decent jobs. Peggy would just get married. That's what girls did. So they moved to the West Coast, clear to Puyallup, Washington, where he got a job working for a company in town, and Blanche got a job working down at the Indian Hospital in the kitchen. And they did pretty well. Pardon me for picking my nose on the video, but this oxygen dries. It's just constant. It just dries it out in there and drives me crazy. So after they moved to Puyallup, they still had one more child. A lot of controversy over that. Some of the family believes, and I've heard since I was a little boy, that my mother, June, wasn't really the daughter of Blanche and Jack, but her older sister's daughter. That Peggy got in trouble, she was sent away, and when she came back, Blanche and Jack had a new baby. I've never been able to confirm it, although I've heard it all my life. So, regardless, they have another kid, and the kid's name is June. Now, June is going to fall in love with Fredrick. So now the 2 families are going to be joined. June loses Jack, her dad, when she's about 11, 12 years old, and her mother remarries a Dutchman by the name of John de Boer, who was the only grandfather Barbara and I really knew on that side of the family. I adored him. He's the one that taught me to write poetry. Got me interested in reading. Bought me my first novel. It was very powerful in my life. Well, June and Fred have children. They have Sally, Freddie, that's me, and your great-grandmother, Barbara. And from there, you know the story. Barbara has Jim, Jim has Lissa, and Lissa has Hugh. So you have all this incredible heritage in you. Now, we actually have relatives in England who came to visit my grandmother on a couple of occasions, and my grandmother used to write them. My mother used to send cards back and forth to somebody in England. And let's see, if Barbara is your great-grandma, my mother would have been your great-great-grandmother, and Blanche your great-great-great great-grandmother actually spoke with an English accent. It was very funny sometimes because the English say things differently than we do in America. For an example, in England, a man's salary, how much money he makes, is called his pecker. And before they had alarm clocks in England, they used to hire people who, for a halfpenny means a half a penny. It was really a complete penny coin, but they called it a halfpenny. That person had a long stick with something on the top of it with a cloth over it so it wouldn't break your window or your shutter. And if you wanted to get up at 7 in the morning, they would come by and knock you up. And so that they were used to that. So I remember one time my grandmother was visiting, and one of my mother's friends came over and said she was going to divorce her husband. And my grandmother's question was, well, what's the matter, dear? Wasn't this pecker large enough? Of course, she meant, what's the matter? Doesn't he make enough money? But nobody in the room except my mother knew that. And, they were aghast. Oh, my, who is this old lady asking these terrible questions? And then one time my grandmother was very late for a birthday party that was being held for me. She was going to take the train up, not the train, but the bus up from Tacoma. Probably could have been the train. The train was still running in those days, but I don't remember because I was at the house at the party. And she came late. There was a delay. So when she stepped into the living room, where I guess we were in the dining room because the folks didn't have their bed downstairs yet. We were in the dining room all sitting around the table with our favors and everything. And I heard her say to my mother, "Oh, I'm so sorry I'm late, dear, but I just didn't get knocked up in time." Meaning, of course, that she took a nap and missed the first train and had to take the second train or something. So, at any rate, that's part of your heritage too. English and Scotch and Mi'kmaq.